Okay, good evening and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ji Young Kim. I'm a moderator of this session. Today, we're going to talk about the diagnosis and the perception for the resumption of diplomacy with North Korea, conversation with the ambassadors to North Korea. So we invited the current ambassador and the former ambassador in Pyongyang. So we're going to talk about the life in Pyongyang, and also we're going to talk about diplomatic relation with North Korea. And then probably we're going to talk about how we bring back North Korea onto the negotiation table. Okay, before I start, let me introduce two speakers. The first speaker is Ambassador Colin Crooks. Colin Crooks became Her Majesty of the Ambassadors to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in December 2018. Prior to this appointment, he was the Minister Counselor in Beijing from 2015 to 2018. And then Ambassador Crooks joined the FCO in 1992 as a desk officer in the Latin America department. Some of the previous diplomatic appointments include Deputy Head of Mission to Jakarta, 2011 to 2015, and then the First Secretary in Washington, 2002-2006, and the First Secretary in Seoul, 1995 to 1999. Basically, he stayed in North Korea from 2018 to until now. So basically, his experience in North Korea is can provide the life, especially North Korean life in Kim Jong-un era. Our second speaker is Ambassador Thomas SCHAEFER. Thomas SCHAEFER served in German Foreign Office from 1981 until 2018. His diplomatic career took him to multiple postings in East Asia and Latin America before he was appointed as ambassador to North Korea from 2007 to 2010. After a subsequent tour as Germany's ambassador to Guatemala, and SCHAEFER returned to Pyongyang in 2013 to serve as ambassador there for the second time prior to his retirement in 2018. He just published the book From Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un, How the Hardliners Prevailed on the Political History of North Korea 2007 to 2020. So this session is going to run by following order. The first two speakers are going to provide some speeches in 10 minutes each, and then I'm going to raise some questions based on their speeches, and then the life experience in Pyongyang. So our first speaker is Ambassador Colin Crooks. Colin Crooks, can you hear me? Actually, I can't hear you. Probably, yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Nice to meet you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Kim. Thanks very much for the invitation to this event. So I'm Colin Crooks. I'm still the British ambassador to North Korea, although I've been ambassador in exile for almost as long as I was ambassador in the country. Today, I will try to talk a little bit about, first of all, the role and position of the British Embassy in Pyongyang, then say a little bit about the situation inside North Korea as I understand it, and finally, I'll talk about some current policy concerns. So we first established diplomatic relations with North Korea in 2000 and opened the embassy shortly afterwards. My first visit to Pyongyang was in the summer of 2008 when I went for a few months as chargé d'affaires, and I returned 10 years later as ambassador in December 2018. My experience of living in North Korea is not as long as that of Ambassador SCHAEFER, but I am fortunate in that my time in North Korea took me to every province, most of the major cities. I've been to Paektusan, Myeongsan, Chilbosan, Kumgangsan, but most of my time, of course, was spent in Pyongyang. The time you spend there as a diplomat in Pyongyang is mostly about experiencing life in the DPRK. It's about evaluating the economic and political situation. I would have meetings with the foreign ministry and with ministries and bodies covering issues like culture, health, education, sports, the economy. And of course, we'd spend a lot of our time working and discussing with the UN, with NGOs, and with other embassies in the country. I was in Pyongyang when flights stopped and the border was sealed in January 2020 following the outbreak of COVID in China. So I experienced, first of all, lockdown on the diplomatic compound in Pyongyang. We then decided to decline the last flight out in early March 2020 because we decided to stay, hoping that the border closure would last for only a few months and we would then, after that, be able to resume supplies and get new people in to relieve me and my small team in Pyongyang, which would have allowed us to keep a continuous diplomatic presence there. But in the late spring of 2020, it became clear that the border closure would last at least until the end of 2020, which was already beyond our tolerances and my government's tolerances for leaving us there. We did try to find a way to get new supplies and new people into the country, which would have allowed us to continue, but to no avail. So with regret, we decided to withdraw our diplomatic staff and temporarily close the embassy, and we left by road to the Chinese border on the 27th of May last year. Since then, I've been working from London. I've still been in contact with friends in the foreign community. In Pyongyang, those numbers are now very small as more people have left. We also maintain diplomatic channels to the DPRK via their embassy in London. And our Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary are both very clear that we want to reopen the British Embassy in Pyongyang as soon as conditions allow. I had hoped to be back this year, but of course that now looks increasingly unlikely, and I will be moving on to other duties in the new year, although I will still be on the Korean Peninsula. But it's still our intention to reopen the embassy presence in Pyongyang as soon as we can. Moving on to the situation in the DPRK, of course, it's becoming increasingly difficult to judge. It's now been over 15 months since I left, and since then, many others have left the country as well. Most other embassies have also now withdrawn diplomatic staff. All NGOs and the UN have withdrawn their international staff as well, and very few foreigners remain. Probably the fewest number of foreigners in the country since the state was founded. Only the Russian and Chinese embassies seem to be there in any numbers. There are about 8 other embassies, as far as I can tell, which remain, but most of those are there with just a very small handful of staff. So independent information coming out of the country is now very scarce indeed. Even when I was there, however, up until May of last year, we could see imported goods beginning to disappear from the shops. The particular ones that I recall being unobtainable were bananas and lemons. But we also saw things like sugar and cooking oil becoming scarce and being rationed to local people through shops. From what I gather now, things have got worse, even in the city of Pyongyang. Shops, restaurants, and markets are empty of many goods. Basic foods, I am told, are still available, but also being rationed and distributed centrally. That's in Pyongyang. We have no visibility at all, of course, of what's happening outside the city, in the countryside and in the provinces. But the UN estimates that even before the COVID sealing of the borders, 40% of people in North Korea were food insecure. And things are surely worse now. So humanitarian concerns are growing on our list of things that we're worried about. I mentioned earlier that I first visited Pyongyang 10 years before returning as ambassador in 2008. And during that 10-year gap, I was able to observe quite notable changes in Pyongyang, much more commercial activity, much more evidence of private enterprise and of markets. And these seem to have changed economic life in the DPRK, even if political life seemed less changed. I suspect that the experience of lockdown of the last 2 years has thrown much of that development into reverse. the Eighth Party Congress and the new 5-year economic strategy talk, of course, of self-reliance. But above all, the sealing of the borders will, I suspect, have choked off a lot of that nascent private sector, of market activity, any activity that depended on exchange with the outside world, and would have put a lot of economic resources and levers back into the hands of the state. Finally, just to mention a few policy concerns that we in the international community still have. Yesterday's report from the IAEA was a reminder that the core nuclear concerns have not gone away. A series of UN Security Council resolutions affirm that nuclear programs and the existence of ballistic missile capabilities in the DPRK remain a threat to regional and international peace, stability, and security. All of these issues remain high on the diplomatic policy agenda with the DPRK, and our core objective as the international community remains achieving denuclearization in line with UN Security Council resolutions. These impose a range of sanctions, and the reasons for imposing them have unfortunately not gone away. We also remain concerned at continuing reports of human rights violations in North Korea. These are a very big preoccupation of the British Parliament, and we have consistently called bilaterally and multilaterally, in private and in public, for these concerns to be addressed and for the DPRK to work with UN mechanisms to bring transparency. We're also, as I mentioned, increasingly concerned about the humanitarian plight of the North Korean people. We worked previously with the UN, with NGOs and the international community to secure exemptions from international sanctions for humanitarian goods and services. The borders were sealed to keep COVID out, but unfortunately they have also kept out humanitarian goods and medicines and forced the departure of international humanitarian staff. We're pleased to hear reports that some humanitarian goods are beginning to get into the country again, and that the DPRK has been given an allocation of COVID vaccines under the COVAX initiative. And we hope that we will see progress soon on getting COVID vaccines into North Korea as well. But we also hope to see the conditions for an urgent, independent international assessment of humanitarian needs in the DPRK. And we also hope that we can see humanitarian workers as well as diplomats returning soon. Just to conclude, time is running out for me to return to Pyongyang as ambassador. And unfortunately, my time as ambassador has not seen much of a narrowing of the gap on the many issues on which my government disagrees with the DPRK. But we remain committed to dialogue and diplomacy, and we continue to be engaged in the search for peace and security on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your speech. You explained about your personal history in Pyongyang, and second of all, you explained the social, economic conditions and political situation in North Korea in COVID-19. Lastly, you mentioned about the current issue relating to IAEA report in North Korea. Thank you very much for your speech. Before we move to second speakers, let me just inform your audience, you watching this session on YouTube. If you want to take some raised question, probably you can click some, I think some link you can raise some question. And some audience in this room, you can just use this QR code, you can raise your question. Yeah, and then we can move to second speakers. If you're ready, could you start?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the honor of being here. I appreciate it. I was ambassador in North Korea from 2007 to 10, and again from 2013 to 18. I'm retired now, and I express my personal opinion, of course, here. Let me tell you about my experiences in North Korea. Germany established diplomatic relations with Pyongyang in 2001 at the request of the South Korean government, which hoped that Germany and the European Union would play a more active role in supporting the Sunshine Policy. Since then, Germany, together with the other EU states, has sought to moderate North Korea through a policy of critical engagement to convince it of the benefits of international cooperation and respect for the rule of law, and to help improve the political and economic situation of the people at least a bit. The balance sheet is mixed. In political terms, I believe that these exercises in confidence building reinforced North Korea's view of Germany as a critical but reliable partner that stands by its word. From a technical point of view, however, the outcome is less positive. The impact of many international projects in North Korea, for example, be they organized by Germany or by other international partners, remains limited. We also experienced some failures, and many good ideas could not be implemented. This was not because the implementing organizations commissioned by the German side had not worked properly. Rather, the political conditions in North Korea are so bad that international project cooperation hardly ever produces truly satisfactory results. A number of basic conditions for successful international cooperation are not being met by North Korea. Humanitarian aid projects, for example, are generally intended to benefit the most deprived sectors of the population, prevent discrimination, and ensure that aid is provided and received in a transparent manner. Aid agencies should always have access to the groups and areas they support inter alia to better understand the needs and to ensure effective control of resources. For a number of reasons, all these conditions are not available in North Korea. To start with, North Korea has different goals and priorities than the donor and international community. The regime is primarily concerned with securing the system. Control of the population, military considerations, and ideological zeal usually take priority over economic or development objectives. This explains the adherence to a notoriously inefficient economic systems, the resistance to any real reforms, the construction of economically nonsensical prestige projects, and the preferential treatment given to Pyongyang to the detriment of the rural communities. Let me elaborate on this last point. Most of the wider elite and regime supporting staff live in the capital city. To provide for them is in the regime's political interest. In contrast, according to the Songbun caste system, the members of the rural communities since Kim Il-sung's time have been considered politically unreliable and therefore, even if in dire need, not worthy of equal treatment. Instead of clamoring for systemic changes, they are expected to accept their life of deprivation as a just retribution for their forefathers' lack of support of the revolution. The difference between the international communities and the regime's priorities, helping the people most in need versus generating political support within the wider elite, is striking. Transparency and project control have always been an issue. Lack of access is a huge impediment. North Korean information and numbers are notoriously unreliable. And the problems have worsened in the last years. For example, since 2014 or so, the international aid organizations have not been allowed to estimate the expected harvest quantities based on their own independent crop assessments. As a result, nobody outside North Korea has any reliable knowledge about how insufficient the food supply of the North Korean population really is. I assume that the situation is quite bad now, but does it come close to the famine in the 90s? We simply do not know. If conditions are really bad indeed, is it not high time for the North Korean government to invite institutions like the World Food Programme, the FAO, and others back into the country to undertake their own independent assessment? Based on their judgment, international help could soon be on its way. But the regime feels threatened by offers to help or cooperate. The leadership views cooperation with foreigners and even mere contacts as a threat to the stability of the regime, against which safeguards must be taken. Take communication control as an example. Almost anywhere in the world, speaking the language of the host country is regarded as an asset. But in North Korea, foreigners who speak Korean are not automatically welcomed, but received with particular suspicion. Some NGOs have even been prohibited from hiring foreign Korean speakers. For some hardliners within the leadership, even safeguards are not enough. Instead, they outright reject almost any form of meaningful cooperation, be it humanitarian aid, economic development cooperation, contract manufacturing in special economic zones, or traditional joint ventures. I would like to emphasize this point. North Korea is not the monolithic country it pretends to be. The regime and the population do not stand united, and there are fundamental differences of opinion as well as power struggles within its leadership. During my time in Pyongyang, during all my time in Pyongyang, almost except the last years, I witnessed differing opinions in the leadership throughout my stay. In September 2007, that is shortly after I came, a few weeks after I came, I had arrived, the North Korean media reported that the government had thanked foreign states, including Germany, for their help in supporting flood victims the month before. A matter of course, one would think. In North Korea, however, the expression of gratitude promptly led to rebuttals. On the same day, a biting comment appeared in Rodong Sinmun, warning against outside help and cooperation. The imperialists, it was said, were peddling support only to achieve their true goals and bring death and destruction. A week later, the newspaper warned against the imperialist policy of ideological and cultural poisoning. It was obvious, even at that time, that some part of the leadership wanted foreign aid and others rejected it. The same applied to foreign investment. During the second Inter-Korean Summit in October 2007, the two leaders raised the prospect of comprehensive South Korean aid and investment. In the following weeks, a semi-public discussion in the North Korean leadership about the meaning of Juche ensued that seemed to question parts of the inter-Korean understanding. A preliminary result of these discussions was presented in the joint commentary of the main newspapers at the beginning of 2008. An increase in economic exchanges with foreign countries and making profit were considered the right thing to do. However, the procurement of foreign technology and capital was no longer mentioned. Instead, economic development was to be based on our own strength, technology, and resources. It was a remarkable outcome. Kim Jong-il, in relations with South Korea and on issues of economic openness, had pursued a policy that did not meet the wishes of parts of the leadership, and dissatisfied hardliners in the leadership had forced him into a retreat. During my years in Pyongyang, I often talked with North Korean officials about development aid and foreign investment. I got the impression that most of them would have welcomed some opening and economic reform. But there were also people that rejected such ideas, as sometimes was openly admitted. Once, during a bilateral discussion with a very high-ranking official, I mentioned that a seminar organized and financed with German support was cut short after the first day because the Korean participants had suddenly been sent to the countryside to help the farmers. When my counterpart started to laugh, I told him, "Do you want to know what I really think? I believe some people here want changes and others don't." He nodded in agreement and said, "Yes, and we need to change that." I heard similar admissions by high-ranking officials several times during my stay in Pyongyang. North Korea became more reluctant to go forward with projects involving foreign or South Korean participation after Kim Jong-il's stroke in 2008, as his political power was waning and the voices of the country's hardliners became more powerful. During the era of Kim Jong-un, the hardliners have increased their sway even more. This development profoundly affected the relationship with South Korea and China. The inter-Korean Kumgangsan project was closed in 2008, and the Kaesong project encountered serious difficulties in 2009 and again in 2013, ironically, soon after the adoption of North Korea's Pyongyang policy, which, in spite of proclaiming simultaneous economic and military development, allocated significant additional resources from the civilian sector to the military, and which, by the way, was contested as well. After the inter-Korean border had been closed for a few days in 2009, temporarily paralyzing the industrial zone of Kaesong, I asked several officials who had decided this. At that time, I only encountered evasiveness. It was only after coming back to North Korea in 2013 that I received a clear answer. After the zone had been closed again, I was told by a high-ranking official that the decision had been taken by the military against the will of the party and the government. It was the first time I had heard a clear admission from a senior official that the military had been responsible for the difficulties surrounding Kaesong and that it had not been the result of a unified regime policy. The closure of Kaesong is only one of several examples of how the power struggle between moderates and hardliners within the North Korean leadership has affected the relationship with South Korea in the last years of Kim Jong-il's and the first years of Kim Jong-un's reign. I'm convinced that these events cannot be plausibly explained by a unified North Korean strategy or a good cop, bad cop policy. Rather, they were the result of infighting and the lack of a consistent, strong leadership. As to China, work on joint project decreased considerably following the downfall of Chiang Son-tek. Kim Jong-il's brother-in-law, with some inclination for opening up and economic reform and close ties to Beijing. The planned special economic zone near Sinuiju never took off, and the new Yalu River Bridge, while completed, was sealed off on the Korean side. Construction work on a new road between Sinuiju and Anju had been abandoned even before. When I later inquired if the construction would be taken up again, some of my partners seemed to think that a new road would be more important to China than to North Korea herself. The North Korean hardliners have been in the ascent since Kim Jong-il's stroke in 2008 and firmly established themselves in the leadership in 2015 or 16 at the latest. They see in aid and economic cooperation less of an opportunity than a risk to the regime's stability. As the closure of Kaesong has shown, they use cooperation or investment as a bargaining chip and are willing to accept financial losses for political gains. While they might well want to see an end to sanctions and would not mind cash transfers or business deals managed at a distance, they fear foreigners as potential conduits of destabilizing ideas and therefore do not want to engage in jointly run projects with other countries. In the winter of 2014-15, they used the Ebola pandemic as a pretext to shut off their country from the outside world and from contacts with foreigners living in North Korea. I suspect that right now, the undeniable, of course, undeniable danger of a COVID-19 outbreak is being abused in the same way. I'm convinced that the hardliners even see the decades-old railway project linking China and South Korea as threatening, despite the evident economic advantages for all parties involved. From their point of view, even the sight of modern passenger or freight trains on transit routes through North Korea would make the DPRK's technological and material backwardness starkly apparent. Ordinary North Koreans watching the trains go by would realize how false everything they had been told about the greatness of their country and its leadership really is. The railway link is only one of many economic incentives that have been offered to Pyongyang over the years in return for denuclearization, opening up economic reforms and improvements in human rights. During Kim Jong-il's rule, North Korea would accept economic incentives in return for denuclearization pledges. North Korea got extensive oil and food supplies as a result of the Geneva agreed framework and the six-party talks, for example. The collapsed 2012 Leap Day agreement devised under Kim Jong-il's rule also included economic provisions. During Kim Jong-un's time, however, North Korea has placed more emphasis on progress towards its goal in the realm of security policy. Since 2012, it has been regularly calling for an end to joint military drills, the withdrawal of American troops from the peninsula, replacing the ceasefire agreement with a peace treaty and ending South Korea protection from the US nuclear umbrella. To be clear, Pyongyang did not entirely cease its economic demands. It has continued to demand sanctions relief, but its calls for economic concessions have been weaker than security demands. It's a shift of emphasis rather than an either-or negotiating stance. When I asked representatives of various North Korean institutions what a peace treaty should include, the answer always included the withdrawal of US troops from the Korean peninsula and sometimes getting rid of the nuclear umbrella. Sanctions relief was only mentioned incidentally. When inquiring what Pyongyang's demands for the US to abandon its hostile policy exactly meant, the answers were similar. The end of maneuvers and the withdrawal of troops ranked first. The lifting of sanctions was subordinate. On several other occasions, I have been bluntly told that there could be no progress on the issue of nuclear weapons without an end to joint maneuvers and the withdrawal. North Korea has also demonstrated how little it cares about the resumption of joint economic projects. In October 2019, Kim Jong-un himself ordered the demolition of South Korean-built buildings at Kumgangsan. In June 2020, his sister threatened to blow up the Inter-Korean Liaison Office in Kaesong, and shortly afterwards, North Korea did just that. By the way, that the fact that it was the son and the daughter of Kim Jong-il that threatened the destruction of the buildings was not only directed at South Korea. I believe that it was also a swipe by the hardliners at the legacy of Kim Jong-il, of Kim Jong-il's inter-Korean initiatives that in North Korea have always been regarded as his personal pet projects. In July 2020, Kim Jong-un made the limited importance North Korea attaches to sanctions relief very clear. Her statement said that the denuclearization on the Korean peninsula can be realized only when there are major changes made on the other side. I have to point out clearly that it does not mean the lifting of sanctions when we refer to major changes from the other side. I myself have no doubt that instead she referred to American troop withdrawal. To summarize, the shift of emphasis in the negotiating position reflects the rise of the hardliners. For them, money takes second place. Their primordial goal is to weaken the US-South Korean relationship, get American troops off the peninsula, and ultimately achieve Korean reunification on their terms, of course. I believe that as long as hardliners dominate the North Korean leadership, trying to entice the regime to reform and denuclearize with economic incentives will ultimately prove fruitless. And that is not to say that we should stop trying trying it, but we should keep on offering cooperation with North Korea. But only once North Korea's moderates regain some control will Pyongyang again realize the benefits of opening up economic reform and hopefully move towards denuclearization and an improvement of its dismal human rights record. I know that this is a sobering analysis, but what are the prospects for better circumstances and what can we do now? Now, time is not on Pyongyang's side. Economically, North Korea is at an impasse. The gap to China and South Korea will continue to grow. More outside information will seep into the country. Dissatisfaction will increase. The voices within the leadership that want to follow the Chinese or Vietnamese path will grow louder again. At some point, opinions within the North Korean leadership will shift and the country will perform a change in direction. Until then, the international community should take, I believe, a long-term view. It should maintain political and economic pressure on North Korea, supplemented by a willingness to improve communication channels, talk, and negotiate. For a long time, South Korea has wanted to establish a liaison office in the north. I firmly believe that the US and Japan should follow suit and offer the establishment of liaison offices in Pyongyang as well as Washington and Tokyo, preferably in a joint trilateral initiative. I know the difficulties that such an initiative would imply, but it would send a strong signal of unity to Pyongyang. If there's a need for humanitarian aid, confirmed by relevant international institutions, it should be provided. Small confidence-building measures that do not only create trust, but provide broader substance to a dialogue should be offered, even if it is far from certain that they would be welcomed. Political dialogue with North Korea should be wide-ranging. It should include human rights. De-emphasizing human rights is is not the right approach. North Koreans might get the impression that human rights are of minor importance to foreign countries as well. Moreover, in the case of North Korea, de-emphasizing human rights has not led to greater willingness to talk on the part of North Korea. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was very interesting speeches which talk about the power struggle between hardline and moderating groups in North Korea, how these political groups is working in North Korea relating to North Korea's foreign policy. That was very interesting, and then you concluded how international society engaged in North Korea with the dialogue and then some support in the human rights issue and humanitarian aid. Okay. Let me take a first question. The question goes to both of you speakers. The first question goes to Ambassador Colin. What are the most important changes in North Korea during the Kim Jong-un era you consider? And if there are any memorable episode, tell us about that episode which can explain the change in Kim Jong-un era. Same time, I would like to ask about your Twitter. Probably some of the audience understand what I'm talking about, the Twitter, because you are very famous regarding to tweeters of North Korea. I also used your tweeting cases in my academic papers. So how did you start your tweeters in North Korea? And also, how do you understand, how do you evaluating the change of North Korea in digital era, even if there is no internet in North Korea? But I understand there are 5 million people are using smartphone, and also they are connected in internal telecommunication lines. This is my question. The first question goes to Ambassador Colin. And then my first question goes to Ambassador Thomas. Is probably same question. What are the most important changes in North Korea during the Kim Jong-un era? Because you stayed in North Korea, the first term is 2007 and 2010. This is first term you stayed in North Korea. The second term is 2013 to 2018. So you must feel some changes between Kim Jong-il era and Kim Jong-un era. Even if you evaluating Kim Jong-un and the Kim Jong-il era, I mean there is obvious aspect or obvious facts about North Korea, political systems and economic system, etc., etc. But the reason why we are taking this session is to find out promising or more constructive way to engage in North Korea. So I would like to ask some question about the difference between Kim Jong-il and the Kim Jong-un era. Is there any promising aspect or wishful thinking relating to Kim Jong-un era? Okay. Ambassador Colin, would you like to answer to my question?
Yeah, thanks very much. A number of different questions there, Dr. Kim. Thank you. I mean, I think that I always compare the North Korea that I found on my first visit in 2008 with my return in 2018. So perhaps that's a proxy for the changes in the Kim Jong-un era. I don't think it's simply a question of. I agree. I think that there are definitely differences of opinion within the North Korean state around various aspects of policy. And I think that those play out sometimes in private, but sometimes you see evidence of those in public. And also in my time, like Ambassador SCHAEFER, I saw evidence of different messages coming from different parts of the state. I'm not sure it's simply a case of hardliners prevailing over moderates. It's quite hard sometimes to find moderates in North Korea. I think of it more as a consistency of goals. I think that security is always the primary goal. And I think that at certain times, economic activity and the existence of a private sector and exchange with the outside world are perceived as playing different roles in support of that security. I think there was a period when large parts of the regime perceived international exchange as being something that would increase their security and reinforce their military goals. I think we saw that right through quite a lot of the Kim Jong-un era, and I saw on my return to Pyongyang so much more commercial activity, so much more investment. Quite a shift in the profile of the markets. For example, you asked for a memorable episode. I'm not sure that there's a particularly one thing that I would single out, but I just remember walking through some of the back streets in Pyongyang and coming across a sign for, I think it was a pencil factory or something, and looking around the corner, and the pencil factory was basically, its main asset was a large forecourt, which was the parking lot for a huge number of commercial taxis. So businesses that might have started out in one business were then branching out into other things. I think that those are some of the things that I remember as changes in the Kim Jong-un era. I think we've seen a shift clearly since the collapse of the Hanoi summit and the COVID lockdown. And I think that we now, perhaps in some parts of the state, have a different perception. Clearly, that those who think that international exchange is a threat are currently prevailing. I think there will come a time when that perception shifts again. But I do think that security has always remained the primary goal of the state. On Twitter, as an ambassador, I see it as one of my roles to increase mutual understanding and to shine a light into dark areas. And Twitter was simply one tool for doing that. And I'm gratified and pleased to learn that it's been of some use in your researches, Dr. Kim. I guess I began that. I think I was probably one of the first ambassadors to do that. I began that to see if I could find a voice on Twitter and to see what issues of interest I might raise. And I was quite pleased at the response that I got. North Korea, of course, is not quite at the digital age as some countries are. Nonetheless, you could see in Pyongyang a number of people, large numbers of people with their own cell phones. As far as I could tell, these were not connected to the internet, but they do have their own intranet. And I also remember on my wanderings around Pyongyang coming across app stores. And app stores in North Korea are not things that you find on their phone. They are physical buildings where you go in, and they have on the wall lists of various apps and things that people can get loaded onto their phone. And as I understand it, people go in there, they point at the app that they want, they leave the phone there, the shop downloads that app onto their phone, and they go off and they do it. It's not something I was able to do because my phone wasn't compatible with that. I would have loved to be able to download an English North Korean dictionary, but sadly I wasn't able to do that. That would greatly have helped my Korean studies.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. So would you like to answer too?
Well, very, very briefly, I believe that the major changes between Kim Jong-il's time and Kim Jong-un's time is that the North Korea is better armed now, is more dangerous than it used to be, and as I said, the leadership has changed. I believe that compared to Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-il had a much stronger position within the elite. He also had to take into consideration the opinions of the various sectors of the leadership, but not to such an extent as it is now the case. And now I believe that we do not really know who is determining factor or person the group of persons in North Korea. I would believe that it is in a small circle, undefined, belonging to the old revolutionary families, consisting of, to a large degree, of military soldiers, as well as internal the members of the internal control organizations, like the personnel departments, the organization department of the party, etc. So I believe it's for the international community, it has become even more, unfortunately, even more difficult to deal with North Korea, because a top-down approach, as it was attempted by Trump, cannot, I believe, succeed. Can succeed even less now than it could during Kim Jong-il's time. Yeah, thank you very much. As to the economic changes, yes, I recognize, of course, the elite, the wider elite has grown, but it is largely restricted to Pyongyang and is confined to a pretty small sector. And I understand that the leadership has, as to markets, has understood that they need markets to an extent, but they seem to have limited the size, the number of markets, for example, to roughly 400 or 400 plus, and so they are determined to, they have resolved to allow some market reform, but only to the extent that they deem it absolutely necessary for not provoking more discontent within the population or the elite. Thank you.
Okay. You talked about the political leaders, also the difference between Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-il era in terms of political assessment by international society or community. Let me ask one more question about this. Is more personal questions. Probably North Korean regime and North Korean peoples is divided. So do you have any memorable moment who you met North Korean people for the first time or second time, which is you never expected this kind of it's normal ordinary people, most memorable moment in Pyongyang life?
Well, of course, North Koreans are normal people, of course, but they really have a very difficult life. And of course there are happy moments, but of course one can see people dance and celebrate and get drunk together, and all of that is true. But I believe the number of these events is probably less, is smaller than in other countries, surely than in Germany or South Korea, and it's simply because the pressure on the people is extremely high, and most aspects of their life are determined by other people. They cannot really decide for themselves. That does not concern only their let's say their choice of profession or education they want to pursue, but it concerns the woman they are going to marry. Somebody told me once, I asked him, how did you find your wife? And then he said, well, my mother chose her for me. And actually it's good because then I won't have any, there won't be any problems because they live together. But on some other occasions he we talked about going abroad, and he said, yeah, going abroad, that would be nice, and you know, see other things and get to know women, you know, that would be nice. And for me, the depressing part in North Korean was really, I found it hard to stay in North Korea after in 2017 and 18. We had been there for 3 years already, again for the second time, and then the fourth and the fifth year political circumstances were very difficult, and to see the suffering of the people and how they were really overwhelmed by their duties and all the obligations they had to fulfill. That was really quite depressing. Now, as to certain moments, I remember depressing moments. I remember once I think we came back from Dandong, from the Chinese border. That's a gravel road, and to Anju. And in some small, before entering some small town, we had to wait for half an hour, and so we inquired some passers-by what was the matter, and so they told us, well, there's an execution going on in the main square, and then we finally could go on, and the people came back from the executions. They had been required to take part in that, and that was not a nice moment. And another, for example, one of these depressing moments was you know, I once asked somebody to tell me about the camps, and he said he didn't want to talk about it, and he said, well, you know, people are just being sent there to die, and which is probably the truth. And for me, and unfortunately, I have these memories, but I also have memories of people I liked very much, and I wonder what has become of them. And I'm sad that I do not have no means to know.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your answer. You explained how political turbulence in 2017 and 2018 affected the North Korean people in terms of ordinary people. And let me take a second question. My second question is just to, you can probably already explain the situation in the COVID-19 area. So could you just tell us about this shortly? My question is, it is being evaluated that North Korea's economy is difficult due to the blockade of North Korea-China border in the COVID-19. How do you evaluate the sustainability of North Korea? Because you already mentioned the Ebola and SARS. You experienced how North Korean government deal with this medical crisis in the past. So how do you expect that COVID moment in North Korea? Can North Korean government can survive? Maintain its political system and economic systems in this crisis, or is there any possibility? Idea on a possibility about that moment? And same question goes to Ambassador Colin. How do you evaluate North Korea's capability in COVID-19 crisis in terms of economy and politics and the social aspect? So Ambassador Colin, would you like to answer first, or?
Okay, you want me in first? Yeah, thank you very much. It's clearly very difficult to tell exactly what's going on, but we have to assume that with the closure of the borders, the lack of availability of imported products, of foodstuffs, of inputs to their agriculture and their industry, that things must be getting tougher. I think that if you look at the response in the 8th Party Congress and the new 5-year economic plan, a lot of it is around reasserting social controls and economic controls in particular. And I think that a lot of resources will have been coming out of the nascent private sector and back into state hands. So I think in the short term, it's put probably more control into the hands of the party and the state. And we've probably seen an increase in internal control and internal security. How long that can last, of course, we have to see, because I think the economy is suffering, and we are concerned about the situation, which is why we're encouraging them to take advantage of the COVID vaccines that are on offer from COVAX. We hope that will give them confidence to begin the process of reopening. And then we do hope to see a return of the international humanitarian community alongside diplomats, as we would then be able to assess just how serious the needs are.
Thank you. Ambassador.
Well, if I understood the question correctly, I would answer that I believe that the economic situation, well, the economy is probably in a bad shape right now. I believe that the life of the elite, of the top elite, remains probably quite unchanged. There were reports yesterday or the day before yesterday about the imports of new luxury cars in spite of the crisis. So the elite provides for itself and continues to do so, and I don't believe they suffer seriously. Life, I don't believe that the situation, except the crop, the harvest. If the harvest, I don't know whether what is the next harvest going to be, and how the food supply situation is of internally produced food. But I believe that the sanctions and the lack of imports and exports does not really affect the rural population, because they do not participate in this economic sector. Usually, we once again from coming back from China, we had to change a tire on our car, and so some people working in the fields helped us, and my wife gave them. We had bought bananas and gave them a bunch of bananas, and they clearly didn't know what it was or what to do with it. Actually, they asked us, what are we supposed to do with it? And then we peeled one and showed them that it's something to eat. Now, the sector of the population that will be affected by what is happening right now is the middle class in Pyongyang, and they probably suffer. And I wonder, for example, what our local staff in the embassies, what they are doing now and how they support themselves.
Okay, we only have 3 minutes. Probably my last question. It's gonna be. Actually, the most important question is the last one. You mentioned about the struggle between hardline and the moderator groups. So in the long term, how we facilitating moderating groups in North Korea to make, the solution in terms of North Korean denuclearization, and also the reform in North Korea. Because you understand the political mechanism in North Korea. So could you answer that?
Well, I basically believe one simply has to let things play out in I know there are different opinions. For example, when the Byongjin policy was discussed in 2012 and 13, there were different opinions in the leadership about it. And one argument, because the people opposed to this policy, which actually led to more military expenses to the detriment of the civilian sector, and they said this is too expensive and our economy cannot sustain this. And the hardliners at that time, or the military at that time, said no, we should do it because in the long run we will save money because nuclear arms are cheaper to maintain than conventional, our outsized conventional forces. And during the Ebola crisis in 2014 and 15, there was a committee, an Ebola committee, high-ranking committee, and they discussed what measures to take. And we learned afterwards, shortly afterwards, that at the beginning they had instituted this quite radical closure of the country, not as radical as now, but still quite radical. And but then that after some months, they saw that the economic costs were getting out of hand, and so the minority within this committee became majority. So some people within the committee switched opinions at that time, and they decided to relax the controls. And I believe that the same will probably happen at some time, and I couldn't say when. Another such moment was at the end of in 2018 actually, at the end of the shortly before the Byongjin policy was announced. We had expected it would be announced at the beginning of 18, when it announced that long-range missiles were functional and had been produced, and actually we had assumed that this would also mean the end of the Byongjin policy. But what happened? A conference organized by the military at that time had taken place. Kim Jong-un was invited and came, or had to come, I don't know, and so a decision was taken shortly afterwards by the Central Committee to continue the Byongjin policy. It was a quite clear case of lobbying by the people who were in favor of continuing the Byongjin policy, and which in concrete terms meant to keep on spending in arms. And the military, of course, said, yeah, but we cannot end this because we need more missiles, and we do not have enough stock. So I believe this really has to play out. And we have our role. The international community's role simply has to be ready to talk, to offer cooperation. I think it's the right thing to do, to offer cooperation, small cooperation and also big cooperation, but big conditioned, small projects, confidence building measures, I think unconditional. And I think as well what should be unconditional as well should be the offer to establish secure communication channels. And I think there, for example, the South Korean attitude has been very correct since a long time, and I believe that Washington and Tokyo should follow suit. And as I said, I believe they preferably should do it jointly together, and they should. And I believe that Seoul and Tokyo should understand that they, in spite of all their differences in other fields, they have to to adopt a common attitude towards North Korea.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador Colin, would you like to answer the last question? Probably you already mentioned how we engage North Korea in terms of international society. You mentioned about medical support and COVID vaccines, etc., etc. And then probably you can provide any other idea or thought to.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't necessarily take on board the whole of the premise of the question, but I think that if the answer is how do we get back into diplomacy and active dialogue with North Korea, I think for me it's what I've already said. It's about keeping our diplomatic channels open. It's about being ready to go back in and reestablish an international presence when the time comes, and we hope that that time will come sooner rather than later.
Thank you very much. It's time's up. So let me just conclude our session. Actually, we talk about how North Korea it is in terms of economy and political struggles between hardlines and moderating groups, etc. There's some shift in economic and social status. But we concluded we need to start some small deal or big deal or unconditional offer to North Korea in order to bring back North Korea into negotiation table. So very realistic conversation, but wistful and then realistic solution too. Thank you very much to great speakers, and thank you very much to audience who participated in this session. Thank you.